Last few decades, Canada has neither spent enough on our defense nor invested enough in our defense industries.
We should all agree that Canada needs to become militarily independent, and that includes not just having a strong armed forces, but the ability to supply that armed forces with the best technology and equipment.
Prime Minister Mark Carney there, and then reaction from Pierre Poilievre, the Prime Minister unveiling a long-awaited multi-billion-dollar defense industrial strategy that bets big on building at home.
Prime Minister, you've said that roughly 3/4 of Canada's defense capital spending flows to the United States. The question isn't whether that number is accurate in a given fiscal year. The real question is structural. Is Canada prepared to redesign its defense economy so that it is no longer defined by that ratio? Mark Carney's answer signals something deeper than a procurement tweak. It's a reorientation. For decades, Canada's defense acquisition model has been shaped by geography and alliance architecture. Proximity to the United States, integration under NORAD, and NATO interoperability requirements made American systems the default, not because of political loyalty alone, but because of industrial gravity. The U.S. defense market is the largest, most technologically advanced ecosystem in the world. When Canada buys American, it plugs into scale, logistics networks, sustainment pipelines, and classified integration frameworks that already exist. That convenience, however, comes with concentration risk. Carney's framework, build, partner, then buy, is designed to reduce that concentration without rupturing alliances. It is not anti-American, it is anti-dependency. The first pillar, build, implies capital allocation towards sovereign manufacturing capacity, aerospace components, Arctic surveillance platforms, naval systems integration, AI-enabled ISR networks, and cyber defense architecture. Canada already has credible industrial anchors in these sectors. What it has lacked is policy sequencing. By placing domestic production first in the hierarchy, Ottawa changes incentives. Prime contractors bidding on major programs will face stronger industrial participation requirements. Offset agreements will no longer be side clauses, they become structural conditions. The second pillar, partner, broadens procurement toward Europe and Indo-Pacific democracies. This is strategic hedging. Diversifying suppliers dilutes leverage. If 75% of spending currently touches U.S. primes or supply chains, even a gradual shift to 50% over a decade would materially rebalance exposure. That doesn't sever interoperability. NATO frameworks allow for multi-vendor ecosystems, but it reduces vulnerability to unilateral export controls or political shocks. The third pillar, buy, remains. Canada will still procure from the United States where capability or integration demands it. The continental defense architecture under NATO and NORAD cannot be sustained through isolation, but purchases become selective, not automatic.
Will this significantly reduce the U.S. share? In the short term, no dramatic collapse is likely. Existing contracts, long lead items, and sustainment obligations lock in spending patterns for years. Fighter programs, naval modernization, and missile defense integration are multi-decade commitments. However, procurement is about future cycles. If new Arctic ISR fleets, cyber systems, autonomous maritime platforms, and AI-enabled defense software are domestically built or co-developed with non-US partners, the cumulative effect compounds. A realistic projection, over 10 to 15 years, the US share of Canadian defense capital spending could decline meaningfully, perhaps by 10 to 20 percentage points, if the framework is consistently applied. That would be significant without being destabilizing. The broader implication is leverage. During the Trump era, tariffs and economic threats demonstrated how trade asymmetry could be weaponized. Defense dependence amplifies that asymmetry. If key systems rely on foreign-controlled software updates, sustainment approvals, or export permissions, political pressure gains teeth. Structural sovereignty neutralizes that pressure. But this strategy carries risks. Domestic defense production is expensive. Smaller production runs mean higher per-unit costs. Canada must avoid romanticizing autarky. Sovereignty without scale can become inefficiency. The policy must balance industrial ambition with fiscal realism and alliance obligations. There's also the political dimension. Diversification will be read in Washington as strategic repositioning. Managed carefully, it becomes burden sharing. Mishandled, it risks being interpreted as distrust. Carney's calculus appears measured. Strengthen domestic capacity, expand allied partnerships, preserve interoperability, reduce exposure. This is not a break from the United States. It is a recalibration of dependency. And strategically, that matters. Economic sovereignty protects trade. Defense sovereignty protects decision-making. When procurement policy shifts from transactional buying to industrial strategy, leverage shifts with it. The result isn't confrontation, it's insulation. And in a volatile geopolitical environment, insulation is power. In other words, this is about freedom of action. Strategic autonomy, as framed here, is not withdrawal from alliances. It is the capacity to decide without coercion in a more fragmented and adversarial world. Canada is not signaling isolation, it is signaling durability. Being a partner of choice rather than a dependent requires three things: domestic capability, diversified supply chains, and fiscal commitment. Without those, autonomy is rhetorical. That's where the numbers become strategic rather than symbolic. Over the next decade, Ottawa is projecting roughly $180 billion in direct defense procurement and $290 billion in defense and security-related infrastructure. On top of that, a commitment to double overall defense expenditures by the end of the decade, amounting to an additional $80 billion over 5 years and roughly $45 billion annually tied to domestic resilience under NATO obligations. These are not marginal budget adjustments. They represent a structural reallocation of capital. The most consequential shift is procurement composition, moving domestic sourcing from roughly 1/3 towards 70% over the next decade. If implemented consistently, that is the real break from dependency, not the speeches. Why does that matter geopolitically? Because defense spending is not neutral. It creates ecosystems. When the majority of capital flows into US-based primes, sustainment chains, and software-controlled systems, structural influence follows. Integration under NATO and continental defense obligations through NORAD will continue to bind Canada and the United States operationally, but procurement concentration amplifies political leverage. Leverage works quietly. Export controls, software update approvals, maintenance dependencies, and classified system access all become potential pressure points during political friction. Diversification reduces that pressure.
From Washington's perspective, an America First arms transfer strategy strengthens industrial dominance and alliance lock-in. It reinforces U.S. scale advantages and ensures interoperability flows through American-controlled architectures. From Ottawa's perspective, overexposure creates single-point vulnerability. Carney's framework, build domestically, partner broadly, then buy abroad, attempts to rebalance without rupturing alliance cohesion. Partnering with Europe, the UK, and Indo-Pacific democracies distributes risk. Building sovereign aerospace, cyber, Arctic surveillance, naval systems, and AI-enabled defense platforms creates internal redundancy. But there are trade-offs. Domestic production can mean higher per-unit costs and longer development timelines. Canada does not possess the same economies of scale as the United States. A pivot of this magnitude requires disciplined procurement management, or cost overrun could undermine political support. There is also the signaling risk. A rapid reduction in U.S. defense market share could be interpreted in Washington as strategic distancing. Managed carefully, it becomes burden sharing and industrial diversification within alliance norms. Mishandled, it could be framed as distrust. The key is execution. If 70% domestic procurement materializes, if $180 billion truly builds sovereign capacity rather than fragmented projects, and if $290 billion in infrastructure strengthens Arctic readiness and cyber resilience, then Canada's leverage equation changes materially. The strategic message is not "we are done with the United States." The message is Canada intends to ensure that no single capital, however close, however powerful, holds decisive structural influence over its security choices. In a divided world, autonomy is not about standing alone. It is about ensuring that partnership is chosen, not compelled. When asked whether Canada can realistically compete with the scale of the U.S. defense industrial complex, Carney did not posture. He reframed the premise. The United States is not just another supplier. It is the gravitational center of Western defense production. Its scale, R&D budgets, and integration networks dwarf those of most allies. Competing head-to-head across the full spectrum would be neither realistic nor fiscally prudent. So Canada isn't attempting symmetry. Carney's answer was precise. Partner where necessary, grow where strategic, integrate where advantageous. That's not industrial rivalry. it's selective sovereignty. President Trump's America First arms transfer strategy is designed to consolidate U.S. dominance in global arms flows and reinforce domestic industrial strength. It prioritizes American manufacturing, American supply chains, and American geopolitical influence. That strategy is entirely coherent from Washington's perspective. Carney's response is also coherent, but defensive in nature. For decades, roughly 3/4 of Canada's defense capital spending flowed south. That produced efficiencies, interoperability, logistics alignment, predictable integration under NORAD, and alliance coherence within NATO. But efficiency and dependency often coexist. When a nation relies heavily on another for mission-critical systems, radar architectures, aerospace components, software-defined weapons platforms, sustainment approvals, the relationship carries embedded leverage, not malicious by default, structural by design. Carney acknowledged that dependency directly. Then he outlined how it changes.
First, Canada will always procure the best supplier for its defense needs. That line matters. It reassures allies that capability remains paramount. Sovereignty cannot come at the expense of operational readiness. Second, partnership expectations are rising dramatically. Industrial participation will no longer be optional offsets. Canada wants development rights, technology transfer, supply chain inclusion. In practical terms, that means foreign primes seeking Canadian contracts must embed Canadian firms into production ecosystems. Third, domestic share will more than double as a proportion over the next decade. If defense spending itself is expanding significantly and the domestic share within that spending is rising, the relative market share of foreign suppliers necessarily contracts. Carney invited observers to draw conclusions. The implication is obvious. This is what makes it a quiet revolution. It is not an abrupt decoupling. It is a recalibration of leverage. The example of the Security and Defense Partnership Agreement with the European Union underscores this shift. Being treated as a local supplier within a €150 billion European defense framework is not symbolic. It diversifies industrial exposure. It embeds Canadian firms into transatlantic production lines beyond the United States. It creates redundancy. Redundancy is resilience. Can Canadian industry compete with the U.S. industrial complex in aggregate? No, that is not the objective. Can Canada develop competitive strength in targeted sectors? Arctic systems, ISR technologies, AI-enabled defense software, naval construction, aerospace subsystems, cyber resilience? Yes, particularly if capital commitments are sustained and partnerships broadened. The strategic shift is subtle but consequential, from dependency to participation, from buyer to co-developer, from concentrated exposure to diversified alignment. For decades, defense spending created comfort. Now it is being used to create insulation. The message to Washington is not confrontation, it is balance. And in geopolitics, balance reduces leverage without breaking alliances.